Hey folks, it's Dr. Sam, and I want to welcome you to another EyeClarity podcast. We are at podcast 107, and I have a very interesting show today. This is a special podcast where I'm actually presenting a presentation on the three diaphragms of the body. Now, there are many diaphragms of the body, but in this presentation, which I am doing for a group of somatic educators, the organization is called Continuum Movement. And Continuum was started by my mentor and friend, Emily Conrad. She passed away a few years ago. And I've been asked by the executive director, Donna Leah Getz, who is running the organization now. We are having a weekend meeting with the Continuum teachers. These are teachers in training. And I've been asked to give a presentation, and then we're going to do what we call a continuum dive. And the topic is going to be on the diaphragms. Now, you might say, what do diaphragms have to do with the eyes and vision? Well, as you know, that I feel that every part of the body is related to itself, and the diaphragms offer us the opportunity of oxygenating, creating more oxygen in the blood. And whenever we have more oxygenation, we have more hydration, the cellular metabolism works better because the mitochondria receive the energy to work more efficiently and also to get rid of metabolic waste. And we know in eye disease, a lot of the eye problems are related to metabolic waste that accumulates. But this is more of a macro global presentation, so I'm not going to be talking about the eyes, but I am going to be exploring the diaphragms, and it's very interesting. So enjoy the show, and thanks for tuning in. So everybody, I want to welcome you to my presentation this afternoon, and it's so great to see all of your smiling faces. And yes, we are definitely being presented with some challenges, but we are also given the opportunity to help a lot of people through this amazing modality, continuum movement. And I chose this particular topic today for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is that it took me back to my wellness, the practitioner training that I did with Emily. It was back in 2011. And the Wellsprings training, when I did it with Emily, to be able to spend 21 days with her was mind-blowing, as you can imagine. And in one of our sessions, she and I were outside the studio in Santa Monica. Those of you that have been to our studio, and we were having lunch, and we started to talk about the importance of our breathing. And of course, one of the things I've learned from Emily is that we need to take a baseline, and I think Donna Leah will attest to that. And it's such a great way to measure, what's going on at any level. And Emily and I started to talk about, how many different diaphragms there are in the body. And that was a new topic for me. And so it inspired me to start studying, what are the different diaphragms and how do they relate to each other? We think about the respiratory diaphragm as the main one, but we have many others. And, with the COVID virus, one of the parts of the body that it really attacks is the respiratory system. I have a friend of mine who's a pulmonologist, and he works a lot with asthmatic patients, and it's been very challenging for him when somebody gets COVID and they have a weakness in their respiratory system, how COVID affects the lungs, and that the standard treatment is dexamethasone, but we know that there's so many side effects from the steroids that on the long term it's not a great treatment plan. And of course, with things like continuum movement, if we're working with people who say are vulnerable in their respiratory system, continuum is like perfect, as for helping people learn to self-regulate. And another thing I learned from Emily in the Wellsprings training was looking at tissue and reading tissue. And it's a little harder to do in the Zoom, but when we get back together, I think it's a wonderful practice to be able to, say, take one of the students and watch how the tissue is informed based on our breathing or lack of breathing. I remember a person that Emily had been working with who had stage 4 cancer, throat cancer, and he actually came into our training one day, and there were, I guess, 24 people in our Wellsprings training, and he lay down in the middle of the studio, and we did about a 2.5-hour dive. And Emily pointed out the tissue from the radiation, and of course you could see how damaged it was. And just after doing that dive, you could see the regenerative quality of being in the field, being in the sound field, all the things that we were doing at that time. And it really opened me around how potent continuum is at changing tissue, whether it's on the external or if it's on the internal. And as we go through the diaphragm anatomy and physiology today, it's going to give you some ideas on what you might want to address either in your own process, your family's process, and hopefully your students. And I've got more to say about Emily, but I'll save that for the presentation. So the topic today is the three the diaphragms, and my invitation is that this is a regenerative inquiry. And when I talk about our interconnectedness, one of the things that I want you to consider is your own interconnectedness with your own diaphragms. Again, one of the things I learned at the Wellsprings is that the more attuned and resonant and coherent I am, then my clients or my students are tracking me, they're tuned to me. And so I'm kind of like leading them. And so if I'm exploring what's the connection of my diaphragms, and they're pretty connected, that transmission immediately then comes to people. And I can tell you right now, with a lot of the sessions that I'm giving and classes I'm teaching, because of the fear mongering that's going on and the fear level, our diaphragms are pretty shut down. And I'll speak more about that in a few minutes. So on all my presentations, I want to give a tribute to Emily. I just so love her, and she's with me all the time, and just deep gratitude with her visionary work. So these are quotes from Life on Land. The first one is, from an evolutionary perspective, adaptability is the key to survival. And I'd like to accent that by saying that what I've observed in my family's health and my health and all my community, that one of the things that I really teach is something called versatility and adaptability. And I believe the continuum movement is one of the ways to really access a deeper adaptability. And especially in these times, the more adaptability we have on a cellular level, on an immune system level. This is how we're going to navigate and evolve to the next level. Another quote from Emily: without the understanding of how fluid organizes itself within our tissue, it would be difficult to understand movement as information. And this echoes when, not only when I'm teaching continuum, but also when I'm doing craniosacral therapy, when I'm counseling somebody. I really kind of hold this idea of the fluid, the movement carries the information. And we see this in water. You know, I did a number of water studies looking at water that spirals and water that runs in a straight line, like city water. And in my measuring devices, I found that water that was spiraled carried an information that had a higher frequency and vibration. So it was interesting when I was introduced to continuum and how we talk about spiral wave pulsation. And when we start doing that in our body, we are creating structured water in us. And the definition of structured water is water that that's vibrating at a high resonance stream, and there's more efficiency in our hydration. And if we can do that across the board, I think it reduces inflammation. It certainly is going to neutralize things like stress, trauma, and toxicities that we're all dealing with right now. All right, two other quotes from Life on Land. Respiratory structure and design of the diaphragm will either inhibit or expand breath. This in turn will signal our cranial bones to adjust to a greater or lesser requirements. And when we speak about the diaphragms today, I'm going to bring in, just spotlight for a moment, the cranial bones, because again, in my cranial work, I have found that through continuum and craniosacral, that as I start helping the cranial bones move, it's a game changer in terms of balancing our nervous system, our endocrine system, and of course, the person is starting to dissolve some of the defense strategies that, again, we're all living with right now. And then the last quote I want to say about Emily, she says, "The stifling of our structure due to rigid patterns of thought as well as action will create an overall inhibition of information, whether personal or biocosmic." And I bring in the biocosmic because we are on a micro level, but we're also on a macro level, and that resonance stream happens from the very minute to the very large. And when we connect to that stream, it becomes very nourishing for us, and it kind of opens up our perspective around species inclusivity. And it's very easy for us to get into a very narrow thought pattern, but this is just a reminder. It's kind of like the bell that goes off when we're doing meditation. Oh, I got to come back to my breath. It's just, that's the bell saying, okay, just come back to the idea of the biocosmic, and that we're really interconnected in that way. So our exploration today of the three diaphragms that I've chosen: the maxillary sinus, the respiratory diaphragm, and the pelvic diaphragm. So I pose this question to you. We could certainly look in any of a number of anatomy books and get a very technical definition. So what I came up with was more of a functional perspective. A diaphragm could be a cavity, a chamber, a container. It is a place of deep possibilities of potentia. And you may find this as you start going into your dive today, that you may be surprised how much information is in there that maybe you weren't aware of. It offers the opportunity for, of course, what we talk about in continuum, dissolution and resolution. So the dissolution could be the exhale and the resolution could be the inhale. If we bring in the mystery school, we can talk about the Ouroboros, birth, death, the ongoing cycle of life. And ultimately, what we're going for is ultimate nourishment. And I'm seeing, and you're probably seeing this too, that most people right now are in a pretty depleted state. My hearts go out to parents now who are trying to homeschool children. And it's a full-time job on top of the financial pressures they're having. And so you've got that whole scene going on. Then you've got the elders who, are afraid to go out. And then, of course, we've got the young folks, the teenagers, and the 20s. And I'm working with these age groups, especially this one, and they're frustrated. Now, one of the things they're doing is they're very adept at online things like TikTok and Instagram, and they're doing very positive, creative things. But ultimately, if we can kind of hold that space of the diaphragm, and I bring the Earth's diaphragm into this Mother Earth, and what's going on in her diaphragm with the fires in California, in Australia, the lungs are burning up. Our lungs, the Earth's lungs, from all the trees. And so there's a lot at stake here, and I feel that the diaphragm is an essential piece of the key that's going to unlock our ability to transcend and learn and move forward. Now, back to more of what may show up for your clients or for you, is that the diaphragm, in my experience, has shown me a direct result of my birth and bonding imprints. I work with a lot of kids with autism, and most of you know that. And I ask a lot of questions about the birth experience, and I'm really exploring the diaphragmatic movement of those kids. And I find all of them are in paralysis around their diaphragm. So those early nonverbal imprints can be maybe accessed through continuum movement. I mean, I do it with the place that I work with. We're working with special needs kids. And it's amazing when I just get them to do 5 or 10 minutes of sound, with the father looking at me very, scowling, like, what the heck are you doing? And then seeing the child get up and have so much light in him or her from just doing some simple sounds and them touching around their diaphragm. It's profound. So I put that to you as a possibility. And then the question I have for you is, what is your definition of the diaphragm? When I'm working with lay people, parents, and so on, the only diaphragm they know is the respiratory diaphragm. So that's the one that I'm pointing out to them, that I'm spotlighting to the parents, because they have a connection with that. However, in my own mind, as I'm kind of observing the child, I am definitely scanning the maxillary and the pelvic, and either through my cranial work or watching them walk, through their posture. You can see a lot of things, obviously, in the sensory motor arena based on for example, the maxillary sinus and the sensory motor systems around the face. Social engagement, bringing some of Dr. Porges' work in on the polyvagal. I can see some things. So I think as you start exploring all the different diaphragms, you got to know the audience you're speaking to. If I start talking about the pelvic diaphragm to parents who don't even know what a diaphragm is, they're not going to get that. So I have to kind of know my audience. But I am looking at all three. Yes, absolutely. At least for me and how I'm going to work with the child. Or it could be anybody. The jellyfish metaphor that you bring into the pelvic diaphragm, beautiful. And it'll be really interesting to hear from the dive how that affects, even as you say, the chakras and the kundalini. Again, these are things that I don't speak about much, but certainly acknowledge. And thanks for bringing it to the group. I think it'll be really helpful as we move forward in the dive. In order to release my pelvic diaphragm, I noticed that my respiratory diaphragm had much more capability and scope. And so for me, the domino effect was release the pelvic diaphragm first, and then the respiratory diaphragm would follow. However, in some of my clients, what I've noticed is that, now this is more with women, is that if they release the respiratory diaphragm, they would heal some of the abuse and some of the things that happened to them, which created a lockdown in the pelvic diaphragm. So I guess my answer is not, it isn't like one answer. One of the things that we do in our deeper classes is we actually have a sharing in partners with diaphragm dialogue. And we have the pelvic talk to the respiratory and the respiratory talk to the pelvic. And, you know, the pelvic diaphragm, and I'll just speak for me, was very loaded. And I think it is probably for a lot of people. And so just accessing that deeper kind of connection releases the toxicity energetically that's there. And I think it's a symbiotic and a synergistic kind of thing. I mean, we'll see what happens today, because the sounds that I'm giving you and the motif is designed to create a release and a connection at a deeper level between those. And then you've got the maxillary up here as the dome. And so we'll see where that fits in. I think it's very individualized. And I think it's something that, again, you can explore. You know, if I go to this slide, well, the diaphragm is consisted of bones, connective tissue, fascia, muscle, fluid, and it reflects so much. I mean, it carries our scroll of history around our nervous system, our fluid body. Again, what is the state of the movement and flexibility of the diaphragm? For most lay people out there, it's not very healthy. And then, of course, you know, I talk about trauma, stress, toxicity, and how that affects the health of and the vitality of the diaphragm. I mean, the diaphragms are sourcing our bloodstream with oxygen. And if we don't get enough oxygen in our bloodstream, then the mitochondria cannot produce the ATP that's needed on a cellular level. So that's going to create metabolic waste, inflammation, oxidative stress, among other things. And then it leads to more chronic problems as well. So the diaphragm is a really key component in our overall, scheme of things. I work with a lot of men who have prostate problems. And it was so funny when I was with Emily, she would bring that up. She'd say, now the men, it's the prostate. The women, it's something else. And I took that to heart, and I work with a lot of men with prostate issues, and I actually use Continuum as a way to help release their pelvic diaphragm, and the prostate gets better. Now go figure, you know, but this is kind of the connection that I see. It'll be interesting to see your community and what you bring to it, and what health changes may occur, you know, in the reproductive areas, in the respiratory areas, and so on. And we haven't even talked about the maxillary and how it affects your cognitive processing, your memory, your balance. When your maxillary sinus is shut down, it wreaks havoc in the brain. And allergies is another big issue. So there you go. We can apply this. So 2 questions for today's inquiry: how to deepen the relationship with each diaphragm, and how to connect the 3 diaphragms so they play together. That's kind of what I'm inviting you to do today.